Hello everyone, this is Grandmaster Pascal Charbonneau, and this is the blunder of the day for day 4 of the Chessable Masters by Chess24. So today, as a blunder of the day, we have MVL featured, Maxime Vacher-Lagrave, who was leading the standings coming into today, but has had a tough day at the office. Here, he finds himself in an unenviable situation where White, who is Fabiano Caruana, has a very nice knight versus a bad bishop. And this is a good knight versus a bad bishop. You see from the pawns, all of Black's pawns are on dark squares, the same color as his bishop. Meanwhile, White's knight is very well placed on e4, and he's got an anchor for the knight, and he's got pawns on the light squares here that have, so he's got either the e4 square or the f5 square for his knight. That being said, material is greatly reduced. There's not a lot left on the board, and so if Black just sits tight, it's quite likely that White will not be able to make progress. But here, MVL makes a move, rook to d4, which is a blunder, and we'll see why. It's a subtle blunder, and I'm trying to show these blunders that are not necessarily the most obvious, but are the ones that we can learn from. And the problem with this move is that it vacates the 7th rank. So now Fabiano plays rook c7, and this doesn't only attack the pawn on a7, it also creates a pin on the bishop versus the king. The other thing that you want to see is that the rook and bishop are placed in such a way that if the knight gets to f5, which it can do quite easily, there's going to be a fork. That combined with the pin makes this position already lost for Black. So he plays a5, which is the only move to defend the pawn, not lose the pawn right away. It turns out that probably the best chance for Black is actually to give that pawn up and try to play the position down a pawn, but that's going to be a lost endgame. So he goes a5, knight to g3. So already knight f5 is a threat, a big threat that would win a piece because there's no way that the rook could come back and defend the bishop on e7, which is now attacked twice by the rook and the knight. So he plays king to e8 so that the bishop is not pinned. And we'll look at other moves here. If he plays a takes b4 actually doesn't change anything. We simply take back. And note that if the rook takes the pawn on b4, knight to f5, and now we're attacking this piece twice and the rook is too far away, cannot come to the defense. The last thing we could look at is playing rook to d6, so that after knight f5, we can play rook e6. That actually doesn't lose a piece right away. However, the rook on e6 is really in a terrible spot. In fact, you can see that after b5, that rook is basically trapped. It doesn't have any squares. And so here, White can make progress in a few ways. One of them is that, let's say Black plays king f8. They actually have a very nice little move, rook c6, which forces a win because if the rook takes, we get a monster passed pawn here with b takes c6. And if the king defends it, then we have knight h6 and we win the rook. So he plays king to e8. He gets out of the pin like this, king to e8. And now this is what Fabiano had to calculate properly. He plays rook takes e7, king takes e7, knight f5, knight takes rook, check, pawn takes knight, king and f4, sorry. You could also play king d3. No, you have to play f4 first. If you play king d3 first, then Black can play king e5 and there's no f4, so that's important. So he plays f4 first, and in these pawn endings, it's usually winning if you have an outside pass pawn, because what it does is that when White creates a pass pawn here, that pass pawn will be a distraction. The king will have to go and gobble it. By that point, this king will go on the other side. And the game ended right here because for players of this level, it's clear that this is winning. But let me show you how the game could continue. For example, A-B, king to d5, king to d3. Now Black, their only move to not lose the pawn is to play b5. And now White goes for the plan that I mentioned before, g5, pawn takes, king e5, and then we just use it as bait, and we go the other way, and this is winning. The king gets to c6. Once we have the king on the 6th rank ahead of our pawn, it's always going to be winning. King e7, king c7 is the simplest, and then we just move forward. So this is how Fabiano won this game. Going back just to the starting position here, when he played rook to d4, the best move would have been to just wait either with rook b7 or a move like bishop d8. And by vacating the 7th rank, he ended up in having two problems. The rook comes to the 7th, which attacks this pawn, and these pieces get placed where they can get forked by the knight. This is something to remember when you play against a knight. You always have to keep in mind the squares where pieces could get forked together. So this is the blunder of the day. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you all tomorrow.